Good afternoon and welcome to the Pervasive Media Studio online lunchtime talk. These are live every Friday at 1 p.m, beaming out live onto your smartphones, laptops, iPads and living room televisions. My name's Luke and I'm the Pervasive Media Studio producer. These talks are our chance to throw open the digital doors of the Pervasive Media Studio and for you to hear more from the people who are part of our community or who are working on things that excite us. An especially big welcome to those of you that are new to the studio, for whom this may be the first time you'll be engaging with what we do. For all those newcomers, here's a little bit about us. The PM Studio is a diverse and collaborative community exploring creativity and technology with everything from comedy to coding and product development to performance art. We're a partnership between Watershed, University of West England and University of Bristol, and we're a home for early stage ideas and companies and a meeting place of both the creative and commercial industries. We are a studio space and we offer desk space, meeting rooms, events and opportunities, all for free for our residents. We are a safe place for artists and companies and creatives to take risks in their practice and make time for collaboration. Today's speaker is one of our newer residents who joined us just before lockdown. It's Owain Astles, and he is a Bristol-based filmmaker, photographer and visual activist. He's currently working on a participatory video project entitled Homeless Lockdown Diaries, working with people experiencing homelessness to tell their own stories and their experiences of the COVID-19 pandemic. Today, he's going to ask how participatory video can be used for empowerment and activism and how we respond to an increasingly virtual space. Quick trigger warning, Owain will talk about the protests that have happened recently in Bristol. He will reference George Floyd in America and will make reference to some traumatic events that involve death and refugees. He will flag these up before he speaks about them as we go through the talk. There is, as always, a Q&A at the end, which is your opportunity to talk to us about the talk, give us your feedback, comments or questions for Owain. The talk runs roughly 35 minutes long, and if you want to ask any questions, just pop them into the chat window and we'll pick them out as we go along. Do feel free to say hello in the chat window as well. It's always nice to see new faces in there. Please remember you will need to be signed into a Google account to do that. But do that now and you can join us there. A captioned and recorded version of the talk will be available here after the talk is finished. In next week's lunchtime talk is by Dr. Timothy J. Senior, who will introduce the Wicked Problems Agency, SuperSum, which is an experiment in wickedness, clumsiness, and messiness. Through SuperSum's projects on rural innovation, dementia care, and community resilience to COVID-19, this talk will explore the real-world implications of running a Wicked Problems Agency. So if you want to find out more about that, or find out what a wicked problem is, join us next week at 1 o'clock on Friday. You can get news on all our future talks by following us on @PMStudioUK on Twitter or @Pervasive Media Studio on Instagram, or by subscribing to our monthly newsletter on our website. Don't forget to subscribe to this YouTube channel and give the video a thumbs up. You can do that right now. The more subscribers we get and the more likes we get, the more we can share stories like this. Please do share the link. It will be available to watch again here. You can share it now as we're going and share it on all your social media channels and invite more people into the conversation. For now, I'm going to hand over to Owain.
Hello, as Luke mentioned, I'm Owain. I am a filmmaker, photographer and visual activist based in Easton in Bristol. I feel like Luke's done the introduction pretty well, so I'm going to skip through that. Who am I? So yeah, as I said, filmmaker based in Bristol. That's me, first Facebook photo. Please excuse me. And I work mainly around the realms of participatory video and participatory art. And I'm going to be talking about a recent project that we started just during lockdown called Homeless Lockdown Diaries, which is a project aiming to tell the stories of people that are experiencing homelessness and have been affected by coronavirus, whether that's people that are currently accommodated in hotels or people in temporary accommodation, just how we've gone about that, how we've responded to doing that in a space that is different in this virtual space. And I'm also going to go through how I believe the image and filmmaking can be used for activism and empowerment, an analysis of what empowerment means to me, particularly within the context of participatory art and participatory forms, and also how I basically found my way into working in this realm and working in participatory video. So first, I'd like to look at this word, empowerment, and actively investigate what it means. It's a word that's thrown around quite a lot, often in slightly damaging contexts even, particularly within the arts sector and the non-profit sectors. I can't tell you how many scripts I've read about homelessness, for example, that claim to be empowering homeless people, however, don't have anybody with lived experience involved. All of the protagonists in the script are not homeless and don't have lived experience, and the homeless characters within the script don't actually have their own agency. And so, yeah, empowerment is a word that I see used a lot, and I believe can be used almost tokenistically. I think it implies a notion of giving power to, or giving a voice to, which can be problematic because it implies that I, or we as people of privilege, essentially have something to give disempowered people that they don't already have. And this is the kind of concept of giving a voice to, and so I kind of challenge that and say, well, okay, I wouldn't assume that anybody does not have a voice. It's much more about kind of instigating that and fomenting that. So to challenge that kind of use of the word, I'd like to look at the work of this lady here, who is a woman called Jo Rowlands, and she's an anthropologist. She describes there as being essentially 3 different models of power. The first is power over. Now, this is essentially a system of power where there is a dominant group that has control over other groups or communities. It also means that in order to gain power in this context, in this system, groups or individuals essentially have to adapt to the rule book set out by the dominant class and adopt their characteristics and how they perform themselves in order to adapt to that dominant class and to access those halls of power. For example, you might think about how in certain situations, women might be encouraged to adopt more masculine traits in order to be more successful in business or in career. And obviously that's a system that can be quite harmful, and I believe doesn't well represent power. And it also assumes that there is a limited amount of power, and essentially is defined by others' lack of power. And by, if one group has power, they wield that over another group, and if that another group wants to gain power, it has to be taken. And so it's basically dependent on others' lack of power. And the second model is power to, which essentially assumes that power is not limited and is between individuals, however, does still take place within pre-existing structures. And whilst it might not be a limited form of power, it still assumes and is dependent on power being enacted from one person to another. And the final form is power from within, which Rowlands talks about as being a model wherein individuals and communities essentially self-generate power. And now this model assumes autonomy over decisions that affect an individual's own life and community control over its own resources. Essentially, it implies that you and your community are the ones that understand the most about your own experiences, your own challenges, and your own capabilities. And therefore, it makes sense that you are best placed to have a say in the policies and the decisions that will affect you and affect your community. Obviously, that might seem like a relatively obvious, simple concept, but unfortunately within this society and within Western society, we too rarely have that system of power over, and we play within that structure. It also means that that representation of lived experience, of people with lived experience in the halls of power, as it were, are not represented and are not there. And so we have a system that uses power over as its dominant model, where essentially a small unrepresentative group has control, autonomous control over decisions that affect a vast array of communities that are totally separated from their own experiences. And this lack of people with lived experience of certain issues, being on boards, being on panels and interparliamentary groups, recently was thrown particularly into light when this guy, Luke Hall, who is the current homelessness minister, suggested that in order to solve the essentially homelessness crisis and post pandemic, when people are being moved out of hotels, homeless people should just move in with family and friends. And take it from me, anybody that has experienced homelessness will be able to tell you that that is very rarely, if ever, an option. So that just goes to show how that lack of lived experience and that lack of representation has very concrete negative effects if we assume that model of power over. However, I believe that we are now at a point where we are moving into society, is moving into a structure that uses more this concept of power from within. And an example of this can be seen really recently. This is where I will reference the Black Lives Matter movement and basically the defund the police movement, which in essence, and obviously this is a slight oversimplification, but it posits that there is a movement of resources away from a certain system and a certain group that is not very representative of the community that it serves, and instead a movement towards community-led measures, wherein again the community being the one that has those experiences and therefore essentially knows what is best for the community itself, is able to essentially power itself. So based on this third model of power from Joe Rowland's power from within, I look at empowerment as being defined by 4 different things. The first of those is an awareness of societal and political structures that surround the self and how those structures have created a system of oppression. An acknowledgement of and a belief in one's own ability, in you as an individual, your own ability to affect change on a societal level. And this is also what educator and author, Brazilian author, Paulo Freire describes as critical consciousness, and we'll come back to him a bit later. Then we have psychological empowerment, which is related to emotional and psychological factors such as self-esteem and self-confidence and well-being. And the final one, which is one that is slightly tricky and problematic, and I would only use within a certain context, but is tangible access to forms of influence and power. Usually participatory art, as it is done in the Western world now, incorporates an element of creating a political space in which there essentially is the opportunity to actually carry out dialogue with decision makers, with policy makers, and put forward their own experiences, put forward their own suggestions, and put forward their own needs and demands to these decision makers. Obviously, that is still partially reliant on this first model of power over, as it assumes that in order to be able to affect this community, there is still that connection needed to individuals and groups with power over. However, I kind of see it as dismantling these didactic systems on different fronts and in different forms. And now I'd like to, that's my personal definition of empowerment and how I use it within my own contexts. I'd like to talk about the image and why it's such a powerful tool in essentially breaking down the current power systems of oppression that we have in Western society. Now, historically, and to an extent still today, literacy and the written word have essentially been used as a means to divide and delineate society between classes, and has been responsible for creating systems of education that discriminate against people of a lower class, with lower literacy levels and with lower education levels. Around the end of the 20th century, however, we essentially, according to this guy, who is a professor and a visual activist at New York University called Nicholas Mirzoff, I think I pronounced that right. He basically posited that at the end of the 20th century, we reached a tipping point where we moved away from a society that was predicated around the written word and into a totally new age of digital visual culture. Now, what is digital visual culture? Well, let's look at some statistics. In 2019, 66% of the global population was recorded as being active mobile phone users, with 56% of those, 56% of the global population being connected to the internet on a regular basis. On social media, posts that include images invariably have higher engagement rates than text-only posts. And as of May 2019, over 500 hours of video were uploaded to YouTube every single minute. There are over 1 trillion photos taken every year. And I love this one. Every single minute, there are more photos taken in the United States alone, every single minute, than globally during the entire 19th century. And I think that just goes to show the power and the extent to which we've moved, again, away from this delineated society based on literacy and based on the text, into a world that is now based on the image. Obviously, most of these are selfies or dick pics, but I think that the point still stands, that we've literally moved away from this, Luke's laughing at me, that we moved away from this society that is oppressive based on class, and we're starting to, at least in the very, very early stages of moving into one that can be more democratic based on the image. What's my point with this? Obviously, historically, we've been molded and coded by essentially a dominant class, an oppressive class that has deliberately created these systems that are divided. However, this is now changing, and I see image playing a much greater role going forward in communication and representation, and as being a means to redress power imbalances. I'm going to reference Black Lives Matter again, and again, it's quite an obvious example, but it feels negligent not to mention it, where a video, an image of the murder of George Floyd has sparked global protests and instigated an unprecedented breaking down of societal systems of oppression. Obviously, you only have to look at Minneapolis already, where the city council has already pledged to completely disband the police department. Or obviously right home here in Bristol, when Edward Colston came down finally. And it's just an example of where that image, which has complications and issues within itself, and I'll come on to that in a second, that image was so powerful on its own, without a text, without a post, without an article, was so powerful as to essentially instigate this movement. Obviously, the Black Lives Matter movement has been going on for years and way before this, and this is far from a new issue, but you can just see the level of engagement that it's had globally thanks to this one video, this one image. Another less recent example is the image, and I'm going to talk briefly now about Alan Kurdi and about themes of death and refugees, basically. But I'm sure many of you will remember the photo of Alan Kurdi that circulated in 2015, which showed this young boy, this toddler, who was a Syrian refugee. And it was taken by a photographer, Niloufer Demir, and obviously he washed ashore in Turkey, right on the doorstep of Europe in 2015. And what was incredible about this image was that through mimetic protest, it essentially turned Europe's and other countries' policy towards accepting refugees on its head within a matter of weeks. Up until this point, European policy towards accepting refugees had been largely apathetic, and media coverage as well had been negative, largely displaying images such as, well, this image right here, which obviously is the famous poster that Nigel Farage stood in front of, which displays this horde, this mass of people. Or obviously you see headlines such as these, which again they're showing they use these they create these images of a homogenous, faceless group that is almost subhuman. Again, with words such as swarm and invasion. It was obviously used as a way to mold and shape public opinion away from empathy and away from sympathy. And then when we had this photo of Alan Kurdi that came out, it was an incredible sensation, because what happened is that initially it was turned away by traditional media outlets and news outlets. However, it very quickly became mimetic, obviously, which was rapidly being shared through social media, to the extent that traditional news outlets were then essentially forced into publishing the photo, and that directly placed pressure on governments to change their policy towards accepting refugees. And it took, particularly within Germany, where within a matter of weeks they committed to accepting 500,000 or so more refugees in Canada as well, where there was the election going on at the time, and this image is seen as having shifted the favour towards Justin Trudeau, who's obviously now the current Prime Minister of Canada. And it's incredible how this image on its own, again, without context, without text, had that power to so drastically shift and shape public opinion and policy, partly also thanks to its mimetic nature and the fact that it was shared so quickly via social media. Now, of course, this is a link as well. I'll publish this later. There's a link where you can see the photo that I'm referring to if you're not aware of it already. Now, obviously, there are ethical issues with both of these examples that I've just used, and with the concept of a digital visual culture itself. The first issue being, I think, quite importantly, what I would describe as a sort of fetishization of the dead body. Notably, both of these images were not portraying life or exuberance. They were portraying death. And that is ultimately what spurred public opinion. Yasmin Ibrahim, who is an anthropologist, she describes this fascination with the dead foreign body as virtual voyeurism, particularly when an image is shared so much to the point that the body itself becomes an artifact within itself, as opposed to representing an individual. It becomes emblematic of a plight, and almost kind of fetishized in that way. And also, these images obviously have the potential to increase desensitization to performances of extreme brutality, particularly when they are presenting non-white bodies traditionally. There was a podcast, the Ghostwriter podcast, if any of you have checked it out, between Mazen Mustafa and Elias Williams, who many of you probably know. They discussed how the video of George Floyd was largely shared without censoring, and it was largely shared without trigger warnings. And the question is, well, if that were portraying a white victim and a white body, would it have been shared in the same way? And probably not. And voyeurism within itself is an ethical dilemma that has been debated since the creation of the image first began. Susan Sontag, the photographer, critiqued this and wrote about this a lot. And she spoke about there being a model of the look downward, is how she refers to it, which is essentially, again, oversimplification, but the widespread phenomenon of middle-class image makers, obviously, particularly when Susan Sontag was prolific. Photography and image making was relatively only available to people with higher means. Essentially, she describes middle-class image makers taking a voyeuristic approach to looking at and to representing the lives of the poor and the dispossessed, without any real kind of agency, without any real engagement. And again, this is kind of what I talked about earlier with empowerment, that it's too often taking this kind of voyeuristic approach without any real engagement, without any participation. And according to Sontag, the way she puts it is that the camera makes everyone a tourist in other people's reality, which I think is a really, really powerful phrase. And, I'm sure this will be debated for as long as image exists, but I think these are really important points to take into consideration. And a final issue is, of course, that of technical literacy and accessibility. Obviously, if we are moving into an age where we are very much dependent on again, digital visual culture, that inevitably creates certain barriers to people with less technical skills. Again, this is something that I'll touch on a little bit later when I talk about Homeless Lockdown Diaries. But of course, access to technology isn't totally universal. And whilst particularly among younger generations, access to internet and access to image creation tools are increasing extremely rapidly, there is still a disparity there, and so technical literacy obviously is not totally indiscriminate, and people of limited means, obviously people with with visual impairments also are naturally excluded to an extent. However, despite these issues, I do think that the move to this global digital visual culture is something that can really be used and harnessed as part of movements to break down these cultural injustices and these global systems of oppression that have been essentially predicated on class, predicated on race, predicated on gender, predicated on education. And I believe that these movements, such as Black Lives Matter, are really strong examples of how that can be done. As we move into this age where, as Nicholas Merzoff, returning to him, says, the world as a text has been replaced by the world as a picture. And I think that just sums it up really well and can recontextualize how we think about education systems and how we think about, essentially the sharing of knowledge. So now I just want to talk a little bit about myself and how I basically got into this kind of this world, how I started working around homelessness, how I started working with participatory video and participatory filmmaking. And initially, it actually came from a very personal sentiment of when faced with certain social issues, essentially feeling very hopeless in the face of these. And as somebody that was kind of politically engaged, socially engaged, I would often struggle to find my place within the fight, essentially. And where do I put my voice? Where do I place myself? And I'm sure that with obviously the thing that's going on now in the past few weeks, in the past few years, this is a sentiment that many people can relate to, as we're navigating this totally unprecedented world where it's kind of impossible to be apathetic now. It's impossible to not take a stand in some form. And so I basically decided, okay, look, I'm starting out as a filmmaker. I'm going to use my skills and my passion as a filmmaker to try and contribute to these issues. And when it came to homelessness, obviously it's an increasingly visual issue with street homelessness. And it was something that was very important to me. I had experienced homelessness personally. However, that wasn't so much my impetus. It was more talking to people and actually hearing so many myths, hearing so many misconceptions around homelessness that I kind of wanted to redress those. So I created a film called Sleeping Rough, which essentially followed 3 different stories of homelessness. And again, despite having my own personal experiences of the issue, I wanted to remove any sense of self and any sense of sort of auteur-ishness or personal perspective in the film, make it a truly democratic experience where the stories of the people that were involved were front and center, and essentially to create a more genuine portrayal. And so what we did is we collected interviews over the space of about a year from people that were experiencing homelessness or had experienced homelessness, particularly street homelessness, from all around the UK, and essentially constructed a narrative, just a narrative outline with experiences that we took directly from those interviews. We then, I worked with a cast essentially that had lived the experience of homelessness themselves. And we devised, using this kind of very vague narrative outline that had been taken from the interviews, we devised scenes with the actors, again, who had the experience of the issue themselves, to create these stories. And now I think we can go to a clip, please, Martin.
They're all alcoholics or they're all drug addicts or whatever, you know. I didn't give people the time of day, you know. I thought they brought it all on themselves.
There's nowhere to go. The hospital filled. Like, you know what I mean? There's nowhere to go.
I mean, I've been beat up a couple of times as well, you know, asking the wrong person for help. I asked someone for some change once, and he just booted me clean in the face, and that wasn't very nice.
Tired, sore feet, feeling lonely, I'm missing your family.
It's a real eye-opener. You know, you take things for granted and You appreciate little things. You get a different outlook on life. You become mature suddenly. You have to. And you have to know how to survive.
Like I said, I thought everybody deserved to be in this situation, you know. Now I'm more aware that, you know, everyone's only one mistake away from being where I am.
Cool. So yeah, so that's the film, and essentially, or that's a snippet. Essentially, with this film, the initial aim was to correct some of the stereotypes and some of the misconceptions that surrounded homelessness, and challenge the othering effect that mainstream media tends to have towards people that experience homelessness. However, at that point, obviously, the film was still very much focused on audiences and on educating audiences, audiences that themselves didn't have the experience of homelessness, as opposed to having that aim of empowering homeless communities in and of itself. So, when we started to screen the film, we went to sort of hostels, and we went to shelters and places where, some of the places where we'd done interviews, and community spaces, again, all around the country, to screen it. And although the initial aim of that was obviously just to kind of be in those spaces and take that in, but also to essentially get people to call it out if the film wasn't genuine, or be able to say, nah, that's rubbish, that wouldn't happen, whatever. However, what was incredible with the responses was that they really, because of the responses that we got, they led me to think about how film and creative arts can actually be a form of empowerment. Now, these are some of the responses that we had. I've never seen myself represented in that way before. I've never seen my story told truthfully. I've never been, I think it's really important, I've never been the protagonist of my story. And again, I think that that's something that I'd never really considered before, and it inspired me to think more about the potential of empowerment through representation. And obviously, as a white cis male, albeit one who's might have experienced homelessness, I'd never really actually been confronted by this thought before, because I am so mirrored and so represented in the vast amount of media and art that is out there. And the essential idea behind this is, well, if media is supposed to reflect society, and media does not have representation of a certain group beyond stereotypes and side characters, then this might actually be able to cause feelings of disempowerment. And essentially, if I'm not represented, if I'm not reflected in this media that represents society, well, clearly I'm not a part of society. Clearly my life is not a valid part of society. And this was something that, in terms of my own thinking, very much came from these responses to the film, where it made me realize how people that experienced homelessness had never really seen true depictions of themselves represented as the protagonists of their own story. But yeah, homeless people generally in film are represented as props, or as caricatures, or subjects for somebody like Reggie Yates or Stacey Dooley to speak to, but through their own lens, as opposed to that person being the protagonist. And of course, I've got to speak to, I cannot speak about this without mentioning this guy, who is somebody that speaks best about this, somebody that most of you will probably know. It's the one and only Nikesh Shukla. And this is what he says. He's obviously, for those of you that don't know, I don't know who you are, but he is essentially an author that speaks a lot about representation within art and representation within literature. And he says this: representation and inclusion in the books we read and the films and TV that we watch can have an active role in our aspiration levels. If we see ourselves as the main character in stories, then you look at them and you see yourself in that role. And Nikesh also invokes the Dominican American writer Junot Diaz, who said this, and I think it's a really creative and really succinct way of describing it. There's this idea that monsters don't have reflections in the mirror, like vampires. And what I've always thought isn't that monsters don't have reflections in a mirror, It's that if you want to make a human being into a monster, deny them at the cultural level any reflection of themselves. And growing up, I felt like a monster in some ways. I didn't see myself reflected at all. I was like, yo, is something wrong with me? That the whole society seems to think that people like me don't exist. And obviously, both Nikesh and Juno are talking here very much from the perspective generally of ethnicity and nationality, or perceived nationality. But through the work that I've done around homelessness, I've found that to be something that really I think is applicable across the board when people are essentially denied an honest reflection of their own experiences. And then the next form of empowerment that I would talk about is empowerment through participation. And the other thing I learned, of course, from the film was about the power of participating and working with communities, essentially to create the work. We collaborated on the film with Cardboard Citizens, who are a theatre company that works with people with lived experience of homelessness. The majority of the actors came from this company, and Cardboard Citizens practices a form of participatory theatre called Theatre of the Oppressed, which was created by this guy called Augusto Boal, who's a Brazilian kind of educator and theatre maker and all-round cool dude. And essentially, through Cardboard Citizens and through doing this, I learned more about these practices. I learned more about Theatre of the Oppressed. I learned more about participatory theatre, participatory art in general, and how it can be used as a practice. And then applying that obviously to my work of participatory video. Now, participatory art is largely based on the pedagogy of this guy that I mentioned earlier, Paulo Freire. That's just such a sick beard. And he essentially advocates for a different system of learning in which, and again, I feel like to get everything in, I am really disgustingly simplifying all of these incredible people's theories that have so much more knowledge and experience than me. But essentially, he posited that the best system of learning is one which is done through forum and done through collaboration, as opposed to what we have now, which is essentially a didactic power down approach. I teach you, you teach me, rather than let's learn together. And again, thinking back to Joe Rowland's 3 models of power, Freire essentially advocated for an education system that was based on this 3rd model of power from within, where we recognize our own capabilities in forum with other people. And on a practical level, essentially what this means is that if I'm going to run a workshop, of filmmaking around homelessness, I would always assume that I'm not the expert. I have my own personal experiences. They might not reflect what somebody else's personal experiences are. I might guide the workshop, I might shape it, I might teach the nitty gritty of filmmaking, exposure, whatever, but I would always assume that participants are learning more from themselves and from each other than they are from myself. Now, what is participatory video? Well, according to Transformative Story, who are a leading participatory video group, participatory video involves a range of video production and screening activities which drive an evolving process of exploration and dialogue on shared issues. In essence, my definition would be it's a community or group using film or video to self-represent, to tell their own truth, and in doing so, explore ways to address the issues of the community. It's about visualizing an issue and visualizing then ways to change that issue. Which brings me to Homeless Lockdown Diaries, which obviously the project that I'm currently working on. And essentially this is a participatory video project that is working with people currently experiencing homelessness, and it's been created as a direct response to the COVID crisis. In Bristol, over 300 people that are currently homeless, and more than 14,500 nationwide have been accommodated in hotels, with many, and that's just to the iceberg, many more people are holed up in some sort of temporary accommodation or council accommodation right now. And essentially this project, what the aims are, the aim is to obviously on the first hand raise awareness around how coronavirus has disproportionately affected people that are experiencing homelessness, how in many cases it's actually had a positive impact in terms of people being able to engage more fully with services, obviously actually having some sort of semi-stable shelter, and to look at what is needed, what people need in order to move on from this crisis and essentially get more stable housing and more stable living. And over a series of weeks, what we're doing is we are working with various people that are currently experiencing homelessness from different areas of the UK to create video content around their experiences of the crisis. And this is entirely filmed by them, entirely filmed on smartphone, nothing from myself or sort of a team. It's all done by the participants. And again, one of the reasons for this was that one of the lies, the misconceptions that has been consistently spread by the media and by the government is that coronavirus is something that does not discriminate, which we've recently seen is absolute BS. It's just not true. People of Black or minority ethnic backgrounds, people on lower incomes, frontline workers, that people living in unstable accommodation have all been disproportionately affected by the crisis. And so part of the reason to set up this project was essentially to spread some of the stories of people experiencing homelessness who've been affected by COVID, to show how the crisis has affected people in more generally more vulnerable positions. And again, on the flip side, some of the positive results that have come out of it in certain cases. Again, with having more secure accommodation and better access to services. We're still in very early stages. It's very much a reactionary grassroots project, so it's constantly kind of changing and adapting as we go, particularly with government regulations and the actual situation changing so quickly. But essentially, the primary aim is to be able to shine light on, in a very visual way, on what's happening to people that are currently experiencing homelessness, and also to create an activity that people are able to be a part of, a creative activity that people are able to use to explore their own experiences during this time. In terms of where we're going, I kind of see it going on for as long as lockdown goes on for, but obviously an important element of participatory art and participatory work, participatory video, is that participants have continued access to the resources that have been provided by the project for continued empowerment. And so we're looking at ways, setting up YouTube accounts, that kind of thing, that this can continue. And obviously with the participants themselves being the content creators, essentially, plan is to kind of work out a dialogue with them and see where they want it to go. And obviously, apart from anything else, we very much hope that it's an enjoyable experience, that whilst it is generally introspective, it can allow for an escape of sorts for people, a creative escape for people that are essentially currently holed up in lockdown and sometimes being starved of new things to do. So I hope that it is a process which can get some enjoyment and some fulfillment for the participants, as well as obviously very importantly learning new skills in storytelling, in filmmaking, in technology, and importantly calling for social change. Obviously this is very much different from previous participatory work that I've done, because in this one we're working in a totally virtual space, and that has created various challenges into how we work. The first of those being outreach. Traditionally, outreach is something that is very physical. It's something that's very much done on the ground. It's very much done by approaching people, working with organisations, coming in to those organisations and talking about the project, actually engaging with potential participants in face to face, to gauge whether they're interested to kind of explain the project. And also something that's really important when working around homelessness is to build trusting relationships before we kind of embark on this process. Another issue is obviously the lack of forum, because as I mentioned, obviously a really important element of this, which Farah talked about, was learning in forum, learning in collaboration, people finding solutions together. And that's obviously something that's not easy to do when people cannot meet in groups. And finally, essentially, it's slightly more difficult to inspire people and to constantly inspire continued engagement when you cannot interact with somebody face to face, and again have that kind of very personal, trusting relationship. But we've come up with certain solutions. One of which is, and again, some of these are relatively obvious, but I think are really important to bear in mind, is consistent check-ins, essentially. So whereas often it might be, we go a week, 2 weeks without engagement, with this one, it'll be a case of having a phone call at least once a week with people and engaging with people via text, via email, however they prefer to communicate, several times a week. As part of that, what we also do is we send prompts as kind of creative inspiration, essentially. So one prompt, for example, is, what can you see from your window today and how does that make you feel? It's obviously very simple, but it's a kind of visual prompt that allows for an exploration of what's going on. And also what we're planning to do is set up later, and this is something that everyone's so tired of, but essentially a forum group call where, or a series of those, where we'll get groups of participants together to actually talk about what they've represented, what they've found, particularly what the issues are that they've come up against, and how they feel that this situation has impacted them positively or negatively, and what are the systems and what are the measures that can be put in place to essentially challenge those issues. Obviously, looking at kind of as the security of having that hotel accommodation is ending and the government is ending its all-in policy, we're kind of looking at ways, looking at what solutions people need, because it's not always as simple as, okay, now that I'm here, I have a better relationship with the charity. I feel confident moving on to some sort of other accommodation. It's never as simple as that. So yeah, we're planning to discuss in forum those ways to challenge those issues. And apart from anything else, there have been benefits from working in this virtual space that might not have been considered before. Essentially learning new forms of communication, obviously, again, for people that, particularly anybody that is slightly more technically illiterate, essentially, or isn't as comfortable with using certain forms of technology. There's been a really strong increase in people's capabilities there, and how people are able to work around the technology simply from essentially doing it throughout the process and doing it on a repeated basis, where videos are sent once or twice a week, and getting more comfortable with that. And again, like I mentioned earlier, we're looking at setting people up with YouTube accounts. People are getting more acquainted with WhatsApp and with WeTransfer for sending videos. And these are essentially tools in the arsenal that can be used later, which we would not have used were this a normal participatory video project that happened out of lockdown. Now, what I'd love to do is show a brief clip from, this is the only one that we're able to share so far, but this is essentially the story, video from a guy called Paul, who is actually based in London, and up until the crisis was regularly bedding down in Heathrow Airport, essentially. So Martin, let's roll the clip.
Day 49 in COVID hotel lockdown. And this is a toughie today. I have been suffering. Look, my eyes are drifting all over the place. That's a telltale sign for anybody that knows me. I've been suffering with my chronic fatigue for probably the last 2 or 3 weeks, and I've managed to maintain it pretty well until this week. One of the big things about being inside that's different for homeless people to probably most people is that for the first time we have the energy and the food to be able to exercise. Getting out for that hour every day is absolutely glorious. Normally I haven't slept because I'm trying to sleep on seats. I now wake up from a bed. Normally I'm so exhausted through the day because I've not eaten, I've not rested, but instead I've had breakfast, I've had lunch, they've both been really healthy foods, and now I'm outside in the fresh air enjoying this glorious park. Now I can't tell you the difference to health being outside, getting fresh air and exercising does for you. I'm sure most people understand it, but until you've gone from the extreme of no sleep, no food, to healthy food, reasonable night's sleep, it's still not great, is just joyous. And for a Londoner like myself, it is the best experience ever. The things I miss the most right now, the little things I miss the most, is human contact. Kisses and hugs and the warmth of another human body next to you and somebody that cares about you. And this is the bathroom. Now, the bathroom is one of those things that changed everything for me, because living at Heathrow, access to sort of toilets and toilets were easy, but showers and getting to shave. So just being able to get up in the morning and go, hey, I'm just going to grab a shave, I'm just going to grab a shower, really has changed absolutely everything. Now, I've heard nothing from Westminster Council about what's going to happen on at the end of this month. So I'm now in this limbo between carrying on as I've been, eating healthily, exercising, but also now my brain is acclimatizing to the fact that I may end up back at Heathrow living on Tesco meal deals. And psychologically, that's a difficult place to be in, because you want to be in a situation where you can look forward in life, always. Those things keep you positive. Those things are the things to look forward to and work towards. And being in this limbo means I don't get that choice. It's impossible to formulate a positive structure from here, because from here, nobody knows what's going on. There are a lot of down days, and you don't want to hang on them. So tomorrow, in my head now, I'm just going, right, I'm writing today off, but I'll get back to it tomorrow. I'll exercise tomorrow. I'll get out there tomorrow.
Cool. That's it. Thank you so much for listening. Obviously, what I'd love to do is hear from anybody that's working on different stuff, on similar stuff, or in similar ways, and is kind of looking for ways to collaborate or just share learnings. That'd be amazing. Keep an eye out for Homeless Lockdown Diaries and what we're going to be doing with it. I think on the next slide you should be able to see my socials. But yeah, thank you.
Owen, thank you so much. Apologies for slightly distracting you in the midst of the talk there. Normally, there's a slight pause at the end of each talk whilst we wait for people's questions to come through, but they're already coming through thick and fast. Before we get into that, I just wanted to ask, I think often when people watch talks about powerful messages like this and important social issues, first instinct is like, how might they kind of like, what can they do next? So just quickly, and I know I didn't ask you to prepare this, so please tell me, we'll post about this later if need be. Is there any particular organizations you'd like to highlight that if people have the financial ability to, they could donate to or support through petitions or letter writing? Just one or two right now would be great, and we can possibly pop a link in the chat.
100%. So actually what we've got at the moment is, if you are based in Bristol, or at least East Bristol, then Thangam Debonair is currently the Shadow Housing Minister, which means that you've got a really good source there to petition and to write to, and so definitely make sure to kind of hit her up. St Mungo's are currently running a campaign based around the everyone in policy and trying to essentially make sure that people aren't going to be chucked out of hotels. So if you go onto the St Mungo's website, there's a petition there that you can sign and also send to your local MP. Also, general charities are ones such as Shelter, who are running a great campaign at the moment as well around similar stuff, but a little bit more broader for anyone that's essentially in rental instability. So obviously, particularly right now with what's going on, people not being sure about what's next, those are really good ones to check out. But what I'd also really suggest is look at what's happening locally, look at what's happening in your local area. Best ways to do that are through Facebook and Google. Just look up homelessness organisation Eastern or your nearest food bank, or anything like that, and find out what you can donate there, whether it's time, whether it's money, whether it's food, whether it's clothes, resources. And finally, also for Bristol, Caring in Bristol have been amazing in delivering literally hundreds of thousands of meals to people shacked up in hotels during this crisis. So if you can support Caring in Bristol in any way, definitely do that as well.
Great. Okay, so a raft of ways for people to get stuck in and take the inspiration perhaps from this talk to help. So there's some really juicy questions, which is great. Camille Aubrey asks, what would be your advice on addressing or embedding intersectionality in participatory projects, particularly in creative practices? Now that is probably a talk in itself, and we might get you back to do that, but like an initial response?
Yeah, I think it's something that's really important to bear in mind, and I think again, I think a lot of the ideas that I put forward might seem simple or basic, but for me, the most important way to address stuff like that is at the beginning of any process, particularly if it is in a workshop group setting, is to make sure that you initiate those conversations, and to make sure that you essentially do that right at the beginning, and that's talks around any issues that people might face because of their personal identity, whether it's things like representation, how people want to be represented during the process, how people want to be addressed during the process. Introduce your pronouns, simple. And so, yeah, and I think it's really important just to have those conversations with participants before it starts, and then have that group discussion right at the beginning of the process.
Great. And then following on for that, another big one. Key question about participatory art from Dr. N.I. Smith is it good? Is it art? Is there a conflict between empowerment of homeless people and making a visually attractive film? Now, if I wouldn't probably ask you to answer all of those, let's start with the last one, because that's like, how do you feel about that? The kind of like the conflict between empowerment of homeless people and making a kind of visual
that is broadcast standard. Yeah, obviously that's it's, I'd say obviously it doesn't have to be that way. Ideally what you can do is you create something that's going to create something that's visually stunning, but also empowers the participants. But obviously it's really a question of where the focus is. With participatory art, the focus is generally not on the product, it's on the process. And so that is first and foremost. If you can then create something that is that looks gorgeous, great, that's brilliant. But if not, not if not, but yeah, again, the priority is the process and the empowerment of participants. And that's really the main difference between essentially observational documentary and participatory documentary. Is one is the product and the broadcast, and one is the process.
So kind of there's another question that's come up just after that, but I'm going to jump to another one and come back to it because this one is directly related to I think we were talking about. Chloe Minek asks, what was behind the decision to get actors to create the first film you made rather than film the actual homeless people you interviewed?
Okay, so a few different things. So first of all, first thing I'll say is the actors themselves had lived experience of homelessness, so that's something that's really important. That was really, really important to me. Partly to make sure that it was a genuine portrayal, and also going for that kind of participatory aspect. And also, to be honest, one of the main ones is because a lot of people, if you're experiencing homelessness, you don't want to have your face shown, you don't want to be visually represented for obvious reasons of anonymity. And that's something you really have to expect and respect. And the majority of people that we interviewed were really happy to chat and even be recorded vocally. A lot of people were, as you hear some of the original voiceovers in the film. But the vast majority didn't want to be visually represented, which is something you have to respect. And again, it's when it's really about the process. Obviously, this film was kind of about both. It was about the process and the product. But when the process is so important, that's something that you really have to bear in mind. And also, something that I like doing is to kind of blur those lines between documentary and drama, essentially. And so while the film is very much real, it's very much all real experiences. There's nothing in there that's kind of exaggerated or dramatized in that way. It's reenactments, essentially. And that's just a way that you can, I think, create something that's a little bit more interesting in some ways, if you can look at different ways to use the form.
Great, thank you. We've got two more we're going to squeeze in. If anyone has a burning question, we can just run over slightly, but drop it into the chat now, otherwise you might miss your chance. Little Miss No Face says, how do you keep, this comes up a lot, I think, when you're talking about socially engaged practice and the combination of activism and arts, but how do you keep moving forward as an activist when the progress might seem very small?
Yeah, that's tricky. That's really tricky. That's the kind of existential problem I have every day. I think, again, going back to this kind of local change, I think that's something that's just where you can really see tangible changes. Again, for me, because with the first film, Sleeping Rough, it was, we just set out to somehow change something. But I was like, well, obviously, we're not going to change government policy. Hopefully we'll change a lot of people's opinions that haven't experienced homelessness themselves. But again, the main benefit that I found, that what I wasn't necessarily expecting for me, was seeing people who had experienced homelessness, their responses to it. And again, that kind of empowerment through representation element. I think that, because that's just on a micro level, and that's where you can see the changes. It's when I saw friends and family changing how they how they treated people, and how they reacted to people that were homeless, and how they talked about homelessness. Hopefully it affected a lot more people than that, but I don't know those people. I'm not going to see those people. Where I can see the change is on my personal level, with people that are around me. And I think if you can do that, then you're doing something.
Great. So I'm going to squeeze two more in, and then we're going to wrap up. Andrew Martin Sugars asks, how has Lockdown Diaries influenced your thinking around the question of you as the auteur in the projects that might follow this project?
Yes. Yeah. So one block essentially has been that usually the literal editing process would be done in commune. That would be done with the participants directly. At the moment, we can't do that. I will edit the video and then send it to them for feedback, and they will suggest stuff, and that will be an ongoing conversation. Really, I'm not the auteur in this. I'm not the director. I'm the facilitator. Really, again, I'm not. The participants are the content creators, and again, I think it's really important to look. I want to make films that are for me and that are personal, and where I may have some sense of auteurishness. With participatory work, that's not how it should be done. I don't think. I don't think it can be done that way, because it's not about, it's not about the director that's coming into a community. No, it's about the community itself. And so, as much, again, I don't want to say as much power that can be shifted that way, because the power is already there. But as much that sense of auteurishness from somebody that might be in a position of privilege can be taken away, the better, I think.
Thank you. And finally, Ashley Hodson asks, do you have any thoughts on universal basic income as a means of empowering people to escape homelessness?
So you say universal basic income?
Yes, yeah.
Why don't we have it yet? What's going on? Why don't we have it yet? Again, it's not straightforward. It's not simple. There's so many, and this is the thing that you realize, is that the system itself is so messed up. So there's so much stuff that has to be challenged. Universal credit is one of the worst things to happen to people on low incomes and in unstable accommodation over the last few years. Food bank, the amount of food bank usage has gone up. This is stuff that people already know, but I think there are so many facets on which it has to be addressed, and I think that as much as possible, where those solutions can come directly from the communities affected, the better. But yeah, 100% we need universal basic income, and we don't have it yet, which is a madness.
Well, that's a really emphatic note to end on. I mean, thank you very much appreciated. Thank you everyone who's tuned in. These talks are live every Friday at 1 o'clock. You can get news on all our future talks by following us on @PMStudio UK on Twitter, or @Pervasive Media Studio on Instagram, or subscribing to our newsletter on our website. Don't forget to subscribe to this YouTube channel before you leave today, and give it a thumbs up. The more subscribers we get, the more likes we get, the more we can share stories like this. Next week's talk is by Dr. Timothy J. Senior, who will introduce the Wicked Problems Agency, SuperSum, which is an experiment in wickedness, clumsiness, and messiness. Through their projects on rural innovation, dementia care, and community resilience to COVID-19, the talk will explore the real-world implications of running a Wicked Problems Agency. So if you want to find out what a wicked problem is or how you tackle one, join us next week at 1 o'clock. Please do share the link from this talk. It's available to watch again here pretty much as soon as we're finished. If you have an idea for your own lunchtime talk and you want to be on this platform and talk about an idea that explores places in creativity and technology and all its intersections, give us a shout. We want to hear from you and what you want to talk about. Thank you very much for watching and tuning in on this Friday lunchtime, and we will see you all again next week.